New Year's Eve is supposed to be one of the happiest nights of the year. People gather with friends, raise a glass at midnight, and welcome a new beginning. But sometimes the strangest things happen when the year is changing. In one story, a man driving home on an icy road encounters a terrifying woman standing in the middle of the street, with a knife in her hand. What happens next leaves him questioning whether he may have witnessed something far more disturbing than a random attack. In another, a man in New York meets a woman at a New Year's Eve party, spends the night with her, and wakes up to discover she has mysteriously vanished from his locked apartment. Then he calls his best friend in Hong Kong and realizes they both met the exact same woman on the same night. And in the final story, two friends celebrating New Year's Eve at a remote Vermont lodge see a strange flash of light over a frozen lake. Then they hear a child screaming for help from the ice, only for the child to disappear without a trace. 3 different nights, 3 completely different encounters. And the more you look at what happened, the harder these stories become to explain. So tonight, let's take a look at 3 terrifying New Year's Eve encounters that still have no clear explanation. I'm using voice transcription to tell this because, honestly, I'm not great at typing and I've never been very good at putting things into words. This happened around 6 or 7 years ago, maybe 8. I'm not completely sure anymore. A lot has happened in my life since that night, and some memories have blurred together over time. But I remember this one. It was New Year's Eve, back when I was still dating my ex, Duda. We had gone to a party at one of her friends' houses, and sometime after midnight we started the drive back to her place. We'd stayed later than we planned. There wasn't anywhere for us to sleep because we had been added to the party at the last minute. So despite how tired we were, and despite the fact that driving on New Year's Eve is probably something you should avoid, we didn't really have another option. The drive was supposed to take around 30 minutes. Fortunately, the roads were almost completely empty. Unfortunately, they were also covered in ice. It had snowed earlier that day, and the temperature had dropped enough to turn the roads into a skating rink. I remember being grateful there weren't many other cars around because the last thing I wanted was to deal with traffic while trying to stay awake on an icy road. Duda was practically asleep in the passenger seat. I had the heat turned up as high as it would go, and I had some random rock playlist playing through the speakers. I was exhausted, but I was doing everything I could to stay alert. We were about 10 minutes from her house when I saw something in the road. At first, I couldn't even understand what I was looking at. The road ahead had been completely empty. Then, suddenly, there was a woman standing directly in the middle of it. She wasn't crossing. She wasn't walking toward either side. She was simply standing there, facing my car. For a split second, my brain couldn't process why anyone would be standing in the middle of an empty, icy road in the middle of the night. Then my headlights fully illuminated her, and I saw the knife. It was hanging at her side, a huge kitchen knife, the kind of thing you'd use to carve a turkey. Her face looked completely distorted. I couldn't tell if she was crying, screaming, or doing both at the same time. I hit the brakes immediately. At the same time, I jerked the steering wheel to the right to avoid hitting her. And that is when she lunged toward the car. I heard a sharp impact. I didn't need more than a second to understand what had happened. She had swung the knife at my car as we passed. I had managed to avoid hitting her, but the combination of my sudden turn and the ice made the car lose traction. The tires slipped. The car started spinning. Duda woke up instantly and began screaming. I grabbed the steering wheel as tightly as I could, but it didn't matter. The car wasn't responding anymore. We spun around until we'd turned roughly 180 degrees, finally coming to a stop facing the direction we'd just driven from. For a moment, everything went silent. Then I looked through the windshield, and my stomach dropped. We were facing the woman again. She was standing maybe 30 feet away, still holding the knife. My headlights were shining directly on her. She was limping toward us. Her clothes were dirty and torn. Her hair was tangled and matted, and she was making this horrible, guttural noise as she moved toward the car. I couldn't understand a single word she was saying. Honestly, I wasn't even sure she was speaking a language at all. She looked injured, but she kept coming. Duda was yelling at me to do something. I couldn't move. I was completely frozen. There was something about her face that I still have trouble describing. Her eyes looked empty, not angry, not scared, just empty. For a moment, she didn't even look like a living person. She looked like someone who had somehow gotten up and started walking again. She was about 15 feet away when my survival instincts finally took over. I threw the car into drive and slammed down on the gas. The tires spun uselessly against the ice for what felt like an eternity. Then they caught. The car surged forward. For one brief moment, I thought we were getting away. I was wrong. I don't know how she moved that quickly, but suddenly she was on the hood. The entire car shook when she hit it. Duda screamed. I started swearing, and the woman grabbed onto the hood with one hand while raising the knife with the other. Then she started stabbing the windshield again and again and again. The blade slammed into the glass only inches from my face. I couldn't think. I couldn't see properly. I couldn't even hear Duda anymore over the screaming, the impacts, and the sound of my own heart pounding. The woman kept stabbing at the windshield as if she was trying to break through it and get to me. And the entire time, she was looking directly into my eyes. I felt like I was about to die, so I did the only thing I could think of. I started jerking the steering wheel from side to side. Hard. The car swerved across the icy road. The woman slid across the hood, but somehow she managed to hold on. I swerved again. She still didn't let go. Then, on the third or fourth attempt, she finally lost her grip. I watched her roll off the side of the hood. She hit the pavement hard. Then she slid toward the shoulder. The car fishtailed behind her, but this time, I managed to regain control. I looked into the rearview mirror. The woman was lying on the side of the road. She wasn't moving, and that is when a completely different thought hit me. What if I had killed her? Maybe she was mentally ill. Maybe she was on drugs. Maybe she desperately needed help. Whatever the reason, I had just driven away after knocking her onto the pavement. Part of me wanted to stop, but Duda grabbed my arm. She was shaking and telling me not to stop. She kept saying we needed to leave, that it wasn't our problem, that getting involved would only make things worse. I told her we should at least call the police. She immediately shut that down. She reminded me that we'd been drinking and said the police would probably blame us. She was convinced they wouldn't believe our story and that we could end up getting arrested. Looking back, none of it really makes sense. But at the time, Duda had a way of making everything sound urgent and completely logical, so I listened to her. I left that woman on the side of the road. I drove Duda home, and I told nobody what had happened. I still regret that. The strange thing was that my car wasn't as badly damaged as you'd expect. The windshield was cracked. There were knife marks on the driver's side window and a few scratches across the hood. But there was almost no blood. In fact, there wasn't even any blood on the car. I had the damage repaired about a week later. The physical evidence disappeared. The memory didn't. For months afterward, I kept checking the local news. I expected to see something about a woman being found dead on that road. Maybe a missing person report, maybe an unidentified body, anything, but nothing ever appeared, and I honestly couldn't decide whether that made me feel relieved or even more disturbed. Maybe she got back up, maybe she wandered into the woods, maybe someone eventually found her. Or maybe I had killed her and somehow there was never a report about it. I still don't know. But the part that bothered me almost as much as the woman herself was Duda's reaction afterward. Within a couple of days, she was completely back to normal. She was making plans, going out with friends, acting as though nothing had happened. I brought up the incident once. She got annoyed. She told me I was being dramatic and that we'd done what we had to do. I remember looking at her and thinking, how can you just forget this? Asterisk, a woman had tried to attack us. We might have seriously injured or even killed her, and somehow Duda was already ready to move on. We broke up a few months later for reasons that were mostly unrelated, but I'd be lying if I said that night didn't change the way I saw her. Maybe I am the one overthinking it. Maybe there was an explanation for everything, but I've never been able to convince myself of that, because even now, I still think about the same two possibilities. That woman might have been capable of taking my life that night, and I might have taken hers. I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, and that is where I met one of my closest friends, Garrett. His real name is Juo, but when we were freshmen, he introduced himself using what he jokingly called his American name. Garrett stuck, and that is what I've called him ever since. He was originally from Hong Kong and had come to the United States to study computer science. He was, without a doubt, one of the smartest people I'd ever met. After graduate school, we ended up on opposite sides of the world. I moved to New York for work. Garrett went back to Hong Kong. We're both in our late 20s now, both doing pretty well professionally and both single. We try to see each other once or twice a year whenever we can. Sometimes he'll come to New York, and other times I'll make the trip to Asia. I am lucky to be able to travel like that, and I don't take it for granted. But one New Year's Eve gave us an experience neither of us has ever been able to explain. And honestly, the more I think about it, the stranger it becomes. Here is something important to know first. Hong Kong is 13 hours ahead of New York, so when it is midnight in Hong Kong, it is only 11 o'clock in the morning on December 31st in New York. Garrett celebrates both the regular New Year and Chinese New Year, so on this particular night he was out celebrating in Hong Kong. I was doing the same thing in New York. I spent the evening with my two closest friends, Rillan and Ari. We started at Rillan's apartment with some drinks before heading to a rooftop party in Williamsburg that one of Ari's coworkers had invited us to. It was a pretty nice party. Around 11:30 p.m., I noticed a girl standing alone near the bar. I walked over and introduced myself. We clicked almost immediately. She was funny, easy to talk to, and had this energy that made the conversation feel effortless. We talked for maybe 5 minutes before she grabbed my hand and pulled me onto the dance floor. Her name was Matre. I'd never heard the name before, so I asked her to repeat it. She laughed and explained that everyone called her My Tree, because that is basically how you pronounce it. Then, apparently worried I'd forget, she took out a pen and actually wrote the spelling on my hand. We kept dancing, we kept talking, and when midnight arrived, we kissed. About half an hour later, she asked if I wanted to leave, so we called an Uber and went back to my apartment in the East Village. I'll leave out the details of what happened after that. Let's just say the night went very well. We stayed up talking afterward, and that is when I learned more about her. She was originally from San Diego. She was an artist, specifically a painter, and she'd previously done graffiti and murals before moving toward more traditional artwork. Her middle name was Mia. She had 2 cats. One was also named Mia, and the other was named Cosmo. Her birthday was April 28th. She told me her childhood best friend lived in a small town in Germany called Hildesheim, and her father was a patent lawyer. Those details probably sound completely random. At the time, I thought they were random too. I had no idea how important they were going to become. At some point, she mentioned that her clothes smelled like the bar. I offered to wash them for her. While they were in the laundry, she borrowed one of my t-shirts. Eventually, we went to sleep. I don't remember exactly what time it was. When I woke up the next morning, she was gone. At first, I didn't think much of it. People leave after hookups. Sometimes they sneak out early to avoid an awkward goodbye. No big deal. But then I noticed something strange. My apartment door was still locked. And I mean properly locked. The lock on my door doesn't automatically engage. You need a key to lock it from the outside. So if my tray had left, she shouldn't have been able to lock the door behind her. But if she hadn't left, where was she? I checked the entire apartment. It was small, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen. There was nowhere obvious for someone to hide. There was no second exit. The windows only opened a few inches. I even checked my closet. Yes, I know how ridiculous that sounds. But at that point, I was genuinely confused. She wasn't there. Then I noticed something else. The clothes I'd put in the dryer were gone, and so was the t-shirt I'd lent her. Which meant she had actually been there. She had slept in my apartment. She had taken her clothes, and somehow she had disappeared from a locked apartment with no other way out. For a while, I started questioning my own memory. I'd been drinking that night. Maybe I'd imagined parts of it. Maybe I'd somehow created an entire person in my head. But that didn't make sense either. I remembered talking to her for hours. I remembered her clothes. I remembered the t-shirt. I remembered everything she told me, and then I realized something even worse. I didn't have her phone number. I hadn't gotten any contact information from her at all. Nothing. No last name, no social media. Nothing I could use to find her. So for the rest of the day, I tried to hold on to every detail I could remember. Her name, San Diego painting. Graffiti, April 28th. Her father being a patent lawyer. Her 2 cats. Mia and Cosmo Hildesheim. I kept going over those details in my head because I was afraid I'd eventually forget one of them. Then, later that afternoon, something strange happened. I suddenly felt like I needed to call Garrett. I can't explain why. It wasn't his birthday. There wasn't anything important I needed to tell him. I just had this weird, almost instinctive urge to hear from him. So I called. We talked for a while. Work. Life. New Year's Eve, nothing unusual. But after a few minutes, I could tell something was bothering him. I asked what was wrong. He hesitated. Then he told me he'd met a girl the night before. They'd hit it off, gone back to his place, and she'd left the following morning without saying goodbye. He hadn't gotten her number. He hadn't gotten any way to contact her, and he was disappointed about it. I laughed. I told him that was almost exactly what had happened to me. Neither of us thought much of the coincidence at first. Then Garrett told me her name. Matre. I stopped. I asked him to repeat it. Matre, my tree. I felt a chill run through me. I asked him what she looked like. Then I started asking questions. Where was she from? San Diego. What did she do? She was a painter. Had she ever done graffiti or murals? Yes. Her birthday, April 28th. At that point, I stopped letting him answer. I asked him whether one of her cats was named Mia. There was a pause. Then he said yes. That is when things got seriously disturbing. For the next 15 minutes, Garrett and I compared every detail we could remember, and everything matched. Not just the major things. The little details matched too. The name, the city, the birthday, the artwork, the graffiti, the cats, Mia, Cosmo, her childhood friend in Germany, even her father being a patent lawyer, and then Garrett showed me something I didn't have. Pictures. He had actually taken photos with her. I looked at them. It was the same woman. There was no doubt in my mind. The exact same face. The exact same person. Now we had a problem neither of us could explain because the timing made it impossible. Remember the time difference. Hong Kong is 13 hours ahead of New York. Garrett had met Maitreyi around 11 o'clock a.m. p.m. on December 31st in Hong Kong. I met her around 11:30 a.m. p.m. on December 31st in New York, so we're talking about roughly 12 hours between our encounters. But a flight from Hong Kong to New York takes at least 15 hours and usually closer to 16 or 17. There was no way she could have left Garrett's place, gotten to an airport, flown across the world, and arrived at a rooftop party in Williamsburg within that window. Even if you somehow ignored the flight time, there were still more questions. How did she know where I would be? How did she end up at that exact party? How did she know me, and how did she somehow give both of us the same name, the same history, the same birthday, the same family details, and the same stories about her life? We tried to come up with explanations. None of them worked. Maybe there was another girl who looked exactly like her. But then why were the personal details identical? Maybe one of us remembered everything incorrectly. But we had the photographs. Maybe we'd both somehow been fooled. But by whom and how? We've talked about it countless times since that night. Every time, we eventually reach the same conclusion. We have no idea what happened. Neither of us ever saw Maitreyi again. I've tried searching for her online, so has Garrett. But Maitreyi, without a last name, isn't exactly enough information to find someone, especially when all you know is that she is supposedly an artist from San Diego. We found nothing, and that is what still bothers me most. I know what it sounds like. It sounds like I got drunk, imagined a woman, and convinced myself the encounter happened. But I know it wasn't a hallucination. She was there. I talked to her for hours. She slept in my bed. Her clothes were in my apartment. She took my shirt. Garrett has photographs of her. And yet, somehow, she disappeared. New Year's Eve is coming around again, and every time the date gets closer, I find myself thinking about that night. Usually, strange experiences become less disturbing with time. This one has done the opposite. The longer I think about it, the harder it is to find a normal explanation. And at this point, I've reluctantly arrived at the possibility that scares me the most. Maybe I didn't meet a living woman that night. Maybe, on New Year's Eve, I somehow spent the night with a ghost. I know how ridiculous that sounds. But after everything that happened, I honestly don't have a better explanation. This story actually happened to my dad long before I was born. Before my parents had kids, they traveled a lot. My dad had made some smart business decisions in his 20s, which gave him both the money and the freedom to spend a lot of time traveling. He and my mom were also serious skiers. Since Vermont was one of the best places they could reach from New York City for good skiing, they eventually started buying vacation properties up there. Their first lodge was in Ludlow. They bought it from a man named Mr. Black, who lived on West End Avenue in New York City. The house had black shutters, so my dad started calling it the Black House. Partly because of the shutters and partly because of the previous owner's last name. They would sell quarter shares to friends and rotate the property between them every few months, which helped cover the expenses. They kept that place for several years before eventually moving on to another property. The second lodge was located along Route 100, roughly between Ludlow and Rutland. Locals referred to that area as the Lake District because there were about 5 lakes lined up along that stretch of road. The house sat right on the edge of one of them. My dad's longtime friend Victor and Victor's wife Lisa went in on the property with my parents. My dad and Victor had been close friends since college, and the 4 of them regularly traveled to the lodge together. Then, one New Year's Eve, something happened there that my dad has never been able to explain. I don't know exactly what year it was obviously before I was born. My mom and Lisa were away for a friend's wedding, or something similar, so that year it was just my dad and Victor who decided to make the trip to Vermont for New Year's. It was December 31st. That evening, the 2 men were upstairs drinking a few beers and catching up. The upstairs had large, full-length windows overlooking the lake, so they spent a lot of time sitting there listening to music and watching the snow outside. It had been snowing that night, but not heavily enough to make the weather dangerous. According to my dad, everything felt peaceful. It was one of those quiet winter nights where you are completely removed from the rest of the world, sitting with an old friend and enjoying the isolation. They had the radio playing in the background, waiting for the countdown from Times Square. Then, without warning, the room was filled with an enormous flash of light. My dad initially assumed it was fireworks, but almost immediately he realized something was wrong. The light hadn't come from the sky. It appeared to come from somewhere across the lake, almost as if it had erupted directly from the ground, and there was no explosion, no bang, no crack, nothing. Just a sudden, blinding flash. Victor immediately got up and walked toward the window. My dad asked what he was looking at. Victor said he thought he'd seen something moving on the other side of the lake. It was dark, but the snow-covered ice reflected enough light that they could make out shapes if they stared long enough. After a few seconds, Victor became convinced. There was someone out there. My dad told him that couldn't be possible. There were no houses on that side of the lake, no roads, no trails, nothing, just woods. But Victor was certain he'd seen a person. He started putting on his coat and boots. My dad tried to convince him not to go. Victor ignored him. He was already heading downstairs. So my dad grabbed his jacket and followed. The two of them stepped onto the back deck. And that is when they heard it. A voice. A child's voice. Someone was shouting from somewhere out on the lake, "Help! Again! Help! Again and again." My dad said the voice was faint at first, but there was no mistaking what it was. A child was calling for help. The lake had been frozen solid for months. Temperatures had remained well below freezing, and there was no question in their minds that the ice was thick enough to walk across, so they didn't stop to think about it. They started crossing the lake. As they got closer to the opposite side, they could finally see a figure standing on the ice. It was maybe 20 or 30 yards from the far shoreline. It was small. A child. My dad said he could clearly make out the shape against the snow. Then the light appeared again. Another enormous flash. It was so bright that my dad had to shield his face. He said he dropped to his knees because the light was almost impossible to look at. For several seconds, he couldn't see anything. Then the brightness faded. My dad slowly looked up. The child was gone. There was nothing on the ice. No footprints. No movement. Nothing. Just snow and darkness. That is when my dad and Victor stopped being curious. They became terrified. They turned around and started running back toward the house. My dad said he was moving as fast as he could without slipping on the ice. Victor was several steps ahead of him when suddenly he stopped. He pointed toward the lodge. He was shouting that someone was standing in one of the upstairs windows. A child. My dad looked up. He saw only dark glass reflecting the snow. But Victor was absolutely convinced. He swore he'd seen a little boy standing in the window looking down at them. My dad couldn't see him. At that point, though, he didn't care. He just wanted to get inside. They reached the house and immediately searched every room, every bedroom, every closet, every corner. Nothing. No child, no stranger, no sign that anyone had entered the house. All the doors were locked. The windows were shut. There was simply no explanation for what Victor claimed he'd seen. Eventually, they gave up searching. Neither man really wanted to discuss what had happened, so they went to their rooms and tried to sleep. They were so shaken that they didn't even realize midnight had passed. But my dad's night wasn't over. He woke up twice. And both times, he heard something inside the house. A child laughing. The sound would come from somewhere in the darkness, but before my dad could figure out where it was coming from, it would stop. He'd lie there listening. Nothing, then silence. Eventually, he'd fall asleep again. The thing that stayed with him the longest wasn't even the child. It was the light. That impossible, blinding flash that had appeared over the frozen lake. Years later, my dad and Victor would still talk about it. They tried to find ordinary explanations. Maybe lightning, maybe a flare, maybe fireworks from some distant town. But none of those explanations really fit. There had been no storm, no obvious source, and whatever it was had happened twice. Both times it appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. Eventually, they decided to cut the trip short. My dad says they didn't tell my mom or Lisa what had happened, not for years at least. Even after they eventually talked about it, neither man could come up with a satisfying explanation. My dad has told me the story 3 or 4 times over the years, and every time he reaches the part about that light, his voice changes. He slows down, almost like he is trying to understand it himself. I once asked him whether he believed what happened that night was supernatural. He just shrugged. Then he gave me the same answer he has apparently always given himself. He didn't know what it was, but he didn't know what else it could have been.